It started out as just a normal day in my small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever seemed to happen. I was scrolling through my phone, lost in the haze of social media, when I came across a post that caught my attention. It was a local mom sharing how her house had burned down in a freak accident. She lost everything, her possessions, her family photos, even her children's toys. My heart ached for her, but as I read the comments, I noticed something strange. Instead of the typical sympathy, the comments quickly turned to bitterness and accusations. Many posters seemed to doubt the sincereness of her need, insinuating it was a ploy to get money or attention. I didn't understand it. This was a mother in distress. I had always thought our community was close-knit, but maybe I was wrong. A few days later, I attended a neighborhood meeting as I always did, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But the atmosphere was tense. People were whispering about the incident, and soon enough someone mentioned the mom and her supposed lies. I felt a surge of anger rising inside me. This woman didn't deserve this treatment. I stood up, shouting about the importance of community and support. Surprisingly, faces softened around me as my words hung in the air, but it didn't change anything. Instead, I was met with a handful of nods and a full spectrum of uncomfortable glances. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of the mom and her plight. I decided to take action. I created a GoFundMe page for her, detailing the tragedy and emphasizing that we, as a community, needed to rally behind her. I was sure that others would want to help. No one could be that callous, right? I shared the link on social media, and at first, the response was positive. Donations trickled in, and I felt a sense of hope. I even received messages of encouragement from friends who expressed their admiration. But soon, negativity crept in again. A few familiar names from the earlier comments started to lash out at my decision. They accused me of throwing money at a scam and called me naive for trusting a stranger. Each time I read one of those comments, a little piece of my enthusiasm crumbled. I prepared myself for the worst, but by the end of the week, I was stunned to see that we'd made a significant dent in the goal. I thought about how proud that mother would be, and how much this support might mean to her. But just as I was feeling optimistic, I received a message on the GoFundMe platform from an unknown user. The message was cryptic and alarming. "Stop while you can. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I felt a chill run down my spine. I dismissed it as just another troll, but the creeping paranoia followed me everywhere, tainting every donation notification with suspicion. The guilt of disrupting the community weighed heavily on me. I swear I could hear whispers every time I stepped outside. It felt as if the townspeople were all staring at me, scrutinizing my every move. I went to buy groceries one day, and as I strolled down the aisle, I overheard two people whispering about me and the GoFundMe. "I can't believe he's so gullible," one said. "Doesn't he know that's just a sad story?" I bolted out of the store, my heart racing. That evening, I decided to confront my fears and went to the mother's neighborhood. I knocked on her door, prepared to give her the cash I had managed to collect. I thought it might clear my conscience. When she opened the door, her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She looked surprised to see me, but she welcomed me in. I handed her the cash with a trembling hand, and in her eyes, I saw gratitude, fear, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. As we talked, she shared her story, how long she'd been struggling even before the fire, how it felt to be viewed with suspicion now that she needed help. I felt her earnestness seep into my bones. But even as I sat there, listening, the message echoed in my mind: "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Was it possible she was hiding something? I left her house feeling more confused than ever. Days passed, and the donations continued to roll in, but so did the hostility. People started to escalate their efforts to discredit the mother, even going as far as to post her old photos, claiming they were evidence of her supposed riches. All of it felt so alienating. Conflicted and overwhelmed, I found myself retreating deeper into my shell, avoiding my friends, my community, and even my family. Then came the night that would change everything. I was jolted awake by an urgent knock on my door. My heart thundered as I peered through the peephole. I saw the mom, drenched in rain, face pale and shivering. I opened the door, alarmed. "Please, I need to talk," she gasped, stepping inside. Quickly, she asked me to lock the door and told me about something sinister happening. There were people snooping around her house, and she suspected it was someone from our community. I felt an overwhelming urge to protect her. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, knowing I could potentially be putting myself at risk. She whispered, "Just come with me." Against my better judgment, I agreed, and she led me to a car parked a few blocks away, dimly lit by the streetlights. Nerves twisted in my stomach as I slipped into the passenger seat, and she drove us into the dark outskirts of town. My mind raced, filled with questions. Eventually, we arrived at an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. When she parked, she turned to me, her eyes wide with desperation. "I know this looks crazy, but if I'm right, we can expose the real truth," she whispered, glancing around nervously. The warehouse echoed around us, filled with shadows and lingering uncertainties. As she explained, a chilling story unfolded. She claimed a ring of local con artists had been targeting individuals in crisis. They had set her up to take the fall, and it was only a matter of time before they decided to come for me and anyone who had supported her. The stakes became painfully real as I realized how deep the deception ran. The dark humor of it all rang in my mind. Here I was trying to help, but now I was caught in someone else's game. The very suspicions that once haunted me began to swirl in the air between us. But in that moment, clarity struck me. Regardless of what was true or false, my community needed reminding that real support comes from honesty and compassion. We should never lose sight of that, no matter how dark things appeared. I took a deep breath and decided to face my fears. "We have to go back," I said, resolved. She hesitated but then nodded reluctantly. We returned to the neighborhood, and at the next town meeting, I stood up, trembling but determined. I shared everything I'd learned, exposing the lies and manipulation that had turned our community against this woman. My voice reverberated with concern, desperation, and hope. As I spoke, I witnessed the shift in the room. The scorn that had thickened the air began to dissipate, replaced by murmurs of shame and guilt. People seemed to recall a time when our town had been filled with kindness, when we had supported each other through our struggles instead of tearing each other down. Although fear was still evident, it felt like a collective awakening, a moment for healing. In the end, a wave of donations flooded in, not just the money but heartfelt gestures of kindness, clothes, furniture, and even emotional support. It was the moment I realized the power of community support. It didn't matter what had transpired. What truly mattered was our willingness to come together and uplift one another, regardless of our differences. As we wiped the slate clean, I looked at the mother, now filled with hope, and for the first time, I saw the promise of what we could become when we focused on the goodness we could achieve together. That day, I learned that while shadows may creep in, the light we share can be even stronger, if we let it.
When I moved into my new apartment, I was eager to embrace the fresh start. The last year had been brutal, with my last place a constant reminder of the relationship I was trying to escape, so the promise of a clean slate in a different neighborhood was everything I needed, or so I thought, until my neighbor, a quiet man in his 30s with eyes like remorseful stones, knocked on my door one evening, just after dusk, and in a voice like he was already mourning the words he was about to share, he asked, "Have you heard the knocking at night?" Until then, the only sounds I'd noticed were the occasional complaints of the old piping and the gentle hum of the city winding down, yet at his question, I felt a chill creep into the warmth of my surroundings, and I shook my head, dismissing the unease settling in my gut, attributing it to the restless air of change that hung over my new life. He seemed grateful that I hadn't heard them, and his eyes darted away as if he was ashamed to even bring it up. I let the moment linger, hoping for some benign explanation, a pipe perhaps, or maybe a neighbor with a late-night hobby, anything that would dismiss the growing tension in the space between us. But as the days passed, the knocking returned, hollow and rhythmic, always during the witching hours when shadows pooled thickly in the corners of my bedroom. It started soft, just a distant thump that I spent my nights trying to rationalize, but it grew louder and insistent, clawing at the edges of my sanity until I could hardly pretend that the noise wasn't there, thriving in the very marrow of the night like a creature that had laid claim to my peace. When I couldn't take it anymore, I knocked on my neighbor's door, desperate for shared experience to quell my nervousness. He opened it with an expression of muted understanding, as if he had been waiting for me to succumb to the same madness that haunted him, mumbling monotonous reassurances that he simply wanted to listen to it together, one eye watching me and the other seemed to stare beyond my face into the dark, waiting for something unspoken to breach the threshold. I agreed, feeling foolish for my apprehension yet unable to shake the chill that wrapped around my heart, so we sat on my battered couch, the dim glow of my single lamp casting long fingers of light over the room, a shield against the growing darkness as we both held our breath, listening, he, with an icy calm that made my skin crawl, and I, with tension lodged in my throat like a forgotten scream. Hours passed before it came, a soft but unmistakable knock, low and steady, from somewhere beneath us, just beyond the floorboards, but when I glanced up at him for an explanation, the look on his face was no longer stoic, his features twisted in raw dread as he whispered, "It's getting closer," and even though I told myself it was all in my head, some kind of shared hysteria that tugged at the seams of sanity, I felt the world collapsing inwards, as if each strong beat of the knocking could summon a force that would unfurl from beneath, reveals the twisted, gnawing truth of its origin. That night marked a new era of dread. It morphed into a sinister presence, an uninvited guest that came knocking on doors, with every thud permeating layers of silence, probing until I could no longer sleep, my insides turning restless as panic carved deeper into my heart. I grew obsessed with mapping the timing of the knocks, wondering if there was any sense to be made from their rhythm, or if it was simply a countdown to my unraveling. The flimsy walls of my apartment transformed into a prison. My heart raced as I convinced myself that each strike was a warning, an eerie preface to something that wanted in, while the shadow of my neighbor loomed, always quietly awaiting the next round of knocks with an almost grotesque anticipation that chilled me deep inside. It felt like we were two broken clocks, forever winding down in parallel, and whenever the knocking hit a crescendo, I could feel his malicious delight from across the room, where I resigned myself to the idea that perhaps whatever was behind the noise wanted to play, an entity reaching out, connected to the darkness beneath us in ways I dared not understand. Nights blurred into a never-ending queue of fear and madness, and I almost welcomed the uncertainty. My mind began to weave in threads of horror and speculation that twisted tighter with each passing hour, turning my thoughts into grotesque parodies of reality until I began to see the knocking not as an intrusion, but as an echo of something hungry, seeking to break into the world of the living, feeding off the despair that clung to our dull normalcy. Then came the night the knocking stopped, as suddenly as it had begun, an unsettling lull where I found myself listening intently, worrying that the absence was more ominous than the noise itself. In that eerie stillness, I could feel the air thicken with expectation, as if whatever had been knocking was now poised to shake the very foundations of our reality. It was around noon the next day when my neighbor knocked urgently on my door, his voice trembling as he gasped, "You must help me. I think it's taken someone," but before I could respond, he turned, his eyes fixing on a point behind me, where horror twisted in his expression, and I felt a cold hand slip over my shoulder, squeezing gently as I turned to face the hall, and for the first time, I realized there wasn't just knocking in the night, the darkness had teeth now, and somehow, it had found a way inside.
When I witnessed an act of kindness, a heartwarming story. It was a cold, bleak afternoon when I witnessed something that would stay with me for the rest of my life, a moment of kindness that still feels unreal, even as I sit here reflecting on it. I was walking home from work, the wind biting at my skin as I hunched into my coat, trying to shield myself from the chill. It had been a tough week. I had been under a lot of stress at work, juggling more tasks than usual, and I hadn't had much time for myself. The streets were busy as usual, with people rushing by, each of them lost in their own little world. I was used to the anonymity of the city, where you could walk down the street and hardly anyone would make eye contact, let alone speak to you. As I walked past a small park, I saw a woman sitting on a bench, hunched over, her face buried in her hands. At first, I thought nothing of it, maybe she was just having a bad day, maybe she was tired. But as I got closer, I noticed that her clothes were tattered and worn, her shoes almost falling apart. She looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in days. There was something in the way she sat, her shoulders slumped, that made my heart ache. I slowed my pace, unsure of what to do. I was just about to turn away when I saw a man approach her. He wasn't wearing anything particularly special, just a regular jacket and jeans, but there was something about him that drew my attention. He stopped a few feet away from the woman, and for a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. I could tell the woman was startled, like she didn't expect anyone to approach her. I felt a strange wave of tension in the air. The man then knelt down in front of her, gently touching her arm. The woman flinched at first, like she was afraid he was going to harm her, but then she looked up at him. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me everything. The man's posture was calm, reassuring. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment, he looked at her with empathy, like he saw her as a fellow human being, not someone to be ignored or avoided. After a moment, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope. He handed it to the woman, who looked at it in confusion, unsure of what to make of the gesture. But when she opened the envelope, her eyes widened in surprise. Inside was a small amount of cash, enough to buy a meal or maybe even a couple of days' worth of groceries. She looked up at the man, her face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. She stammered something, but I couldn't make out the words. The man simply nodded, giving her a warm, understanding smile. Then, without saying anything else, he stood up and began to walk away. The woman watched him go, still holding the envelope in her hands, almost as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, unsure of how to process what I had just witnessed. It was such a simple act, yet so profound. He hadn't given her anything extravagant, just a small amount of money, but it was the way he did it that stuck with me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the human connection, the way he saw her and chose to help her without hesitation. It was a moment that reminded me that kindness still exists in this world, even in places where we least expect it. I continued on my way home, my mind racing with a mixture of awe and confusion. I didn't know why the act had impacted me so much. Maybe it was because I was so used to the cold, detached world around me, where everyone kept to themselves and the hustle of daily life made it easy to ignore the struggles of others. Maybe it was because I had been feeling so disconnected lately, too caught up in my own problems to notice what was happening around me. But witnessing that moment changed something in me. I started to pay more attention to the people around me, the small gestures of kindness that go unnoticed, the way a smile from a stranger can brighten your day, the way a simple "how are you?" can make someone feel seen. It made me realize how easy it is to make a difference, even in small ways. I don't know who that man was or what led him to help that woman, but I'll never forget the way he treated her. It reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's just about being there for someone, showing them that they matter. A few days later, I found myself walking through that same park again, and to my surprise, I saw the woman sitting on the bench again. But this time, she was smiling. She wasn't hunched over, her hands weren't covering her face. She looked like she had more energy, more life in her. She saw me walking by, and for the first time, she didn't look down or avoid eye contact. She gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that something had changed. It wasn't just the money that had made a difference. It was the kindness, the connection. The belief that someone cared enough to help her, to treat her with dignity. It was a reminder that we're all just people, trying to make it through this world the best we can. The act of kindness I witnessed that day wasn't some life-altering moment. It wasn't some earth-shattering revelation. But it was exactly what I needed to see at that point in my life, a reminder that even in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there are still people who choose to make it warmer. And for that, I will always be grateful. When I learned to adapt to change, it was the summer before my senior year of high school. Life was flipping upside down as my family decided to move from our small town to a bustling city when my dad landed a new job. I was terrified of losing everything I knew, my friends, my routines, my entire life in this town. When I got to the new city, everything felt so foreign, like stepping into someone else's nightmare. The streets were crowded, the buildings were tall, and the noise was overwhelming. I remember walking into my new school on the first day, my heart racing, feeling like a mouse trapped in a maze. The halls were buzzing with laughter and chatter, and nobody seemed to notice me. I sat alone in the cafeteria, shoveling my food into my mouth, trying to blend into the background, but no matter how hard I tried, I just felt like an outsider. Days turned into weeks, and I still had yet to make a single friend. I spent my evenings scrolling through social media, watching my old friends post pictures of their summer fun, feeling more isolated than ever. I can't explain it, but I started to feel this strange presence following me. It was weird, like a shadow standing just outside the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was just stress or maybe paranoia from feeling so lost. But then one night, I was awoken by a soft tapping on my bedroom window. It was after midnight, and my parents were sound asleep. I crept down the hall and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. Just the city lights reflecting off the glass, illuminating the emptiness. I shrugged it off as my imagination getting the better of me. The next few weeks were filled with more restless nights. The tapping returned, but this time it came with a soft whisper. "Help me," it said, barely audible, like a breeze rustling through the trees. It was such a strange feeling, like the words were wrapping around my mind, pushing me to take action. I felt drawn to the sound, compelled, like I needed to know what was calling me. I began to explore the neighborhood, searching for the source. I avoided my schoolwork and neglected my social life, focused instead on unraveling this mystery. During my searches, I made an unsettling discovery, an abandoned house at the end of our street that everyone said was haunted. According to the urban legends that floated around, a girl had gone missing there years ago, and her spirit was said to wander the halls of the empty house, searching for something she never found. The more I heard, the more my intrigue grew. One evening, emboldened by my mounting curiosity, and of course, that insistent whisper, I decided to break into the house. With a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other, I pushed the creaking door open, stepping into a world that was untouched by time. Layers of dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped from the corners like eerie curtains. The air was stagnant, filled with a heavy silence that pressed against my chest. I ventured deeper into the house, and the whisper grew louder. "Help me," it called again, filling my senses, almost spiraling into a scream as if whatever was trapped within the walls was desperate for release. I turned a corner, and there she was, a figure dressed in a long, tattered white dress, standing at the bottom of a staircase. Her face was obscured, yet her eyes bore into mine, filled with a longing that sent chills down my spine. Despite the fear gripping me, I felt compelled to approach her. "What do you want?" I stammered. The figure didn't move but pointed up the staircase. Mustering every ounce of courage, I ascended the worn steps, and the moment I reached the top, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath fogging in the chilly air, and that suffocating sense of dread washed over me, but I pressed on. I opened a door at the end of the corridor and found a dusty old room adorned with old toys and children's drawings. In the corner stood a doll, its porcelain face cracked and worn. The moment my fingers brushed the arm of the doll, everything shifted. The whispers flooded my mind, drowning out every other thought. "Play with me," it echoed, intoxicating me with an overwhelming urge to stay. I was no longer in control. I wasn't only in the room, I was swept away into a different world filled with laughter and light. I felt warmth embrace me, happiness I hadn't known since moving. But just as quickly as it came, it vanished. I became aware of the coldness creeping back in, shadows looming closer, and the sense of despair washed over me once more. I blinked and the room was gone. Terrified, I stumbled out of the house, gasping for breath. The figure disappeared, the whispers quieted, but the feeling of something ancient and powerful remained. I stepped outside. The sky was painted in twilight hues, but my perspective had shifted. Instead of sneering at my new life, I felt grounded. The city buzzing around me felt alive, electric. There was a world out there, a chance for transformation, and I had survived something I thought I couldn't handle. I returned to school the next day with a strange sense of peace. I initiated conversations instead of avoiding them, and surprisingly felt a glimmer of happiness. I even befriended a few students who invited me to hang out. The darkness, the haunting I experienced, had shown me that it was okay to embrace the unknown. The old house remained a mystery in the back of my mind, a reminder that sometimes, change comes with shadows, but it also brings new beginnings. I learned to adapt, accepting that life would never be the same, and with that acceptance came a sense of freedom. The city became my playground as I stepped into the vast unknown, ready for whatever came next. The whispers faded into memory, a guiding voice nudging me forward into the life I was meant to live. And even though I never saw the figure again, I felt her presence guiding me, encouraging me to take risks and explore the depths of who I really was, teaching me that even in change, I could find my own way to belong. In the end, I realized that sometimes stepping into the dark could lead to the brightest discoveries and that learning to adapt to change is the most transformative experience of all. How I dealt with workplace drama, a survival story. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle workplace drama. After all, I'd been in the workforce for years and had learned to navigate office politics, cliques, and all the other little nuances that come with any job. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at my new job. I had recently started working at a small marketing agency, a place that seemed like it would be my perfect fit. The company was progressive, with an open-door policy, and the people seemed friendly enough. I quickly bonded with a few colleagues, and everything felt like it was going smoothly, until one fateful Tuesday morning when everything changed. It started as a regular meeting, one of those weekly catch-ups where everyone discusses their progress, goals, and any challenges. I had just finished sharing my latest project updates when I noticed Sarah, a senior manager who had been working at the agency for several years, glaring at me. I tried not to let it bother me. Sarah was known for being a bit standoffish, but I hadn't had any issues with her before. She smiled thinly as I wrapped up my presentation, and I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, but I brushed it off. Little did I know, that moment would be the beginning of a nightmare. The next few days were uncomfortable. Sarah started making passive-aggressive comments in meetings, subtly criticizing my work without offering any constructive feedback. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the more I observed, the more I realized something was off. She would interrupt me in meetings, questioning my decisions in front of others, and whenever I'd suggest an idea, she'd shoot it down without even considering it. The tension in the office started to grow. I could feel the atmosphere changing. I noticed that other coworkers, who had once been friendly, were now avoiding eye contact with me. It was as though a wall had been built between us, and I couldn't understand why. One day, I overheard two colleagues whispering in the break room about the drama unfolding with Sarah and me. I didn't catch all of it, but from what I did hear, it was clear that Sarah had been telling others that I was incompetent and difficult to work with. I felt blindsided. Not only was she undermining my work, but she was also spreading rumors about me behind my back. My gut told me that something more was going on. This wasn't just about my work. There was something personal about this attack. But what could it be? It wasn't until a week later, when I found myself sitting in the conference room with Sarah, that I realized just how deep the problem had become. She had called me into her office for a one-on-one discussion, and I could feel the weight of her presence as I walked in. The door shut behind me with an ominous click, and I sat down, trying to prepare myself for whatever she was about to throw at me. "I've been hearing some things, and I think we need to address them," Sarah said, her tone cold but controlled. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had no idea where this was going, but I knew it wouldn't be good. "What exactly are you hearing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "You've been pushing people around, causing a lot of unnecessary tension. People are uncomfortable working with you." My heart sank. I had no idea what she was talking about. I had tried my best to be a team player, to collaborate and contribute positively. But she was painting me as the villain. "I don't know what you mean," I said, genuinely confused. "I've been doing my job and trying to work with everyone." "That's not how it looks from my perspective," Sarah replied, her voice sharp. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. People are starting to question your role here." I was speechless. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It felt like she was accusing me of things I hadn't done. There was no way to defend myself, especially when the people around me were already turning against me. Over the next few weeks, the situation only worsened. Sarah made it her mission to isolate me from the rest of the team. She started to pull strings behind the scenes, quietly making decisions that affected my work, excluding me from important meetings, and even taking credit for ideas that I had contributed to. I felt like I was being gaslit, nothing I did seemed to be good enough, and every time I tried to address the situation, I was shut down. The worst part was how everyone else seemed to fall in line. My coworkers, once supportive, were now either ignoring me or subtly siding with Sarah. I realized that if I didn't act fast, I would be completely alienated. So, I did what I had to do. I started documenting everything. I kept detailed records of meetings, emails, and conversations where Sarah was either undermining me or spreading lies. It felt like a terrible, toxic game, but I had no other choice. I needed evidence to protect myself. In the midst of all this, I began to feel a growing sense of paranoia. I didn't trust anyone in the office anymore. Every smile felt fake, every compliment seemed like a trap. I started double-checking everything I did, questioning whether I was being too sensitive or if I was actually the problem. I even began questioning myself. Was I the one who was difficult to work with? Was there something I wasn't seeing? But as I continued to document and observe, I started to notice more cracks in Sarah's facade. There were moments when she would slip up, revealing her true intentions. I remember one particular instance when I overheard her speaking to another colleague in the hallway. She was speaking in a low voice, but I caught the tail end of her conversation. She's not going to last much longer here. I'm not going to let her ruin this team. The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just about work for Sarah, this was personal. She wanted me gone, and she was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. Armed with the documentation I had collected, I decided it was time to confront Sarah. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had nothing left to lose. I called a meeting with her in HR. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation as I presented my evidence. I detailed every instance of sabotage, every lie, every instance of exclusion. Sarah sat there, silent and red-faced, as I spoke. When I finished, HR looked at her and then at me. There was a long pause before they spoke. "Sarah," they said, "this behavior is unacceptable. We will be conducting an investigation." In that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had stood up for myself. I had survived the storm. It didn't take long for the fallout to come. Sarah was reprimanded, and her behavior was officially addressed. While I never got the full details, I knew that the truth had come to light. The office dynamics slowly returned to normal, but the damage had already been done. I couldn't forget how easily people had turned on me, how they had all followed Sarah's lead without questioning her. But in the end, I learned a valuable lesson. In the workplace, there will always be drama. There will always be people who try to tear others down to lift themselves up. But as long as you stand your ground, trust yourself, and fight back when necessary, you can survive even the most toxic environments. It wasn't easy, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath, but I came out stronger. And I'll never let anyone make me feel small again.
Last summer, after a long stretch of grueling workdays, I decided to escape the chaos of my life and go camping at a secluded spot deep in the woods, somewhere I discovered years ago and had always wanted to return to. It was a peaceful place, tucked between pine trees with a beautiful, serene lake that mirrored the sky, so I packed my gear and headed out, eager for the tranquility that awaited me. Driving for hours along winding roads, my excitement grew until I finally arrived at the clearing where I planned to pitch my tent, but as I stepped out of my car, I was struck by the unnerving feeling that something was off. There, right where I had intended to put my tent, was a tent already set up, a sturdy canvas monstrosity, dark green and looking suspiciously new. My first instinct was to assume I had come to the wrong spot or that perhaps someone else shared my appetite for solitude, but as I looked around, I realized how utterly isolated I was. My nearest neighbors were miles away, and I was certain I hadn't seen another soul during my entire drive into the woods. I weighed my options. I could turn around and leave, or I could face whatever had set up camp without my permission, but curiosity got the better of me, so I approached the tent, half expecting to find it empty, a remnant of another wanderer's retreat. As I drew closer, a strange sound emanated from inside, a low, throaty hum that made my skin prickle. It was dark in there, the entrance flapped slightly in the breeze as I peered in, my breath caught in my throat. I nervously cleared it, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" But there was no response, just that eerie, persistent hum. Hoping it was simply the wind or perhaps the rustling of some woodland creature, I stepped back and considered just pitching my tent a little farther away. Maybe the other campers were out hiking and I hadn't seen them yet. But as I turned to grab my gear from the car, a chill enveloped me. The air went eerily still, cutting off the sounds of nearby birds and rustling leaves. Pushing aside my growing unease, I made my way back to the tent to investigate once more, thinking maybe there were forgotten supplies that I could use, maybe I could leave a note for the owners telling them I'd be here if they wanted to share the space. I just needed to know if I was truly alone. As I unzipped the entrance and peered inside, my heart raced. I was met with a sight I wasn't ready for. There were no supplies, there were no sleeping bags or camping gear. Instead, in the dim light, I saw a series of crude symbols painted across the fabric walls, twisted shapes that resembled symbols of old religions or something more sinister. And that humming, I could finally make it out now. It wasn't just a sound, it was a chant, a low droning that curled around the back of my mind, making me feel disoriented and confused. It was both beautiful and terrifying, pulling me deeper into the tent and away from the rational part of my mind, screaming at me to run. I stumbled inside, feeling a desperate pull toward the symbols painted all around me, and just as I stepped beyond the threshold, the air changed, thick and suffocating, and I felt an urge to join in the humming, to surrender to whatever was going on inside that tent. A moment's ecstasy fizzled at the back of my mind. I forced myself to turn and bolt back toward the entrance just in time to see the fabric close up behind me like a huge mouth snapping shut. cutting me off from the world outside. Panic coursed through my veins, and I grappled with the tent flaps, desperately trying to reopen my escape, but it was as though I had run straight into the jaws of a beast that would not let me go, a feeling sinking in that made me realize those symbols were alive, writhing like snakes beneath the surface cloth as if they resented my presence. The hum grew louder, swallowing up my yells as I stumbled back, falling down onto the soft bedding that hadn't existed a moment before, nothing but a thin carpet of moss covered by the forest floor. I crawled against the walls in a futile attempt to escape, the chanting echoing louder now, consuming my thoughts, pulling everything to the edge of the abyss while outside, shadows crept ever closer. My mind raced back to the campsite I had spotted miles back on the road. What had I been thinking? Just get back to the car, I begged myself, but I was not alone anymore. In the far corners of my vision, I saw figures forming, shadows growing more distinct with each passing moment. They drifted through the darkness, faces hidden but their movements fluid, elegant, wrapped in the whispers of the forest, and with them, the very essence of the forest seemed to shift. They came closer, and although my instincts screamed at me to run, some part of me held me there, transfixed, as I could finally distinguish the words of the chant. It wasn't just another language, it was an invitation, a beckoning to join their eternal gathering. I couldn't fight it anymore. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the darkness and the elegance of their voices wrapping around me, my heart slowing, my panic ebbing into acceptance as I drifted into their world, a world awash in shadows, where sleeping under the stars was an ancient pact, and I had willingly walked amongst the hushed murmurs of the forest. Hours had passed, though I couldn't tell how many, when I finally opened my eyes to find myself back at the tent's entrance. I staggered out, breathless and disoriented, the sun hovering low in the sky. Everything that had felt so vividly real was now indistinguishable from the remnants of a nightmare. The symbols were gone, and the tent was just a tent, no signs of those figures or the ominous chant. I reached for my things, desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as quickly as I could, but the woods felt alive now, as though it had its own heartbeat, and every rustle sent shivers down my spine. I climbed into my car and drove frantically, the tires kicking up dirt on the desolate road, my heart racing. Back at the town hours later, I tried to rationalize the experience, convinced it was merely fatigue or some hallucination brought on by stress, but there's a drawing feeling that won't leave me alone. Some nights, when I lie in bed, I hear the hum again, soft and inviting, the shadows creeping into the edges of my mind, and I know they are calling for me to return, waiting patiently for my inevitable surrender, and I can't shake this sinking feeling that next time, I might not be so lucky to escape. It was just after closing time at the old Crestview Mall when I heard the whispers of movement, an unsettling rustle that shattered the silence of an empty space where, in the harsh fluorescent lighting, the mannequins stood frozen in their metallic beauty, draped in the latest winter fashion. My shift as the overnight security guard had begun like any other, with the monotony of patrolling the echoing hallways and glancing at my phone to keep track of time. But as I made my way past the deserted food court, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, perhaps another side effect of my chronic insomnia, but as I turned to look, I saw the mannequin in the corner of a clothing store slowly shifting its head toward me, its glassy eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights above. My heart raced, an intense surge of panic flooding my veins, but I tried to reason with myself, convincing myself that I was merely seeing what I wanted to see. After all, they were just lifeless figures, right? I chuckled nervously, shaking off the bizarre feeling gnawing at my gut, and continued my patrol. However, every time I passed that store, the mannequin seemed a bit closer, a bit more alive, or maybe just animated in a way that was too unsettling to comprehend. I dismissed the thoughts, reminding myself of the countless horror movies I'd watched, the tropes that always played out in flickering screens. But then, around 3 a.m, I heard the sound of soft laughter echo through the empty hall. My stomach sank into a pit of dread as I traced the noise back to the back of the mall, where an old toy store had once thrived. Curiosity, or perhaps foolishness, compelled me to walk toward the sound, my flashlight flickering in the oppressive darkness. As I approached, the laughter dimmed, replaced by a ghostly silence that churned my insides with dread. I peered through the grimy glass of the store display, and my breath caught as I saw them. Dozens of mannequins, arranged in a seemingly innocent tableau, but their faces were contorted into expressions of pure malice. One, shoved into the corner with fabric torn and tattered, appeared bewitched, frozen in a grimace that seemed almost human. It was then I noticed the pile of discarded clothing that hadn't been there before, an ominous heap that looked disturbingly like outfits hastily stripped away. Just as I was debating whether to turn back or press further, a clang echoed from behind me, and I spun around to find nothing but the oppressive stillness surrounding me. The mannequins had changed positions, I was certain of it. Panic surged, and I darted down the corridor, desperate for the safety of the exit. As I fled, I felt a cold rush of air, almost as if a hand brushed against my arm, and I slammed into the double doors leading into the main atrium. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to sort through the madness, convincing myself it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But then, I heard it again, laughter, this time sharp and mocking, echoing through the cavernous space, sending chills racing down my spine. I stumbled toward the nearest exit, fighting the urge to scream, but a strange compulsion drew me to glance back at the toy store. The mannequins were advancing, their footsteps soundless yet unmistakable. They seemed to glide toward me, their limbs bending in unnatural ways. I squeezed my eyes shut again, desperately willing myself to wake from this nightmare, but when I opened them, they were mere feet away, their mocking laughter crescendoing into a deafening roar. I turned and sprinted down the mall, my breath coming in frantic gasps, desperate to escape the horror unfolding behind me. I could feel them drawing closer, like predators hunting prey, each step I took matched by a movement from the sea of faceless figures. The sound of their laughter echoed off the walls, a cacophony of glee that sent me spiraling into terror. As I approached the emergency exit, desperate for breath and freedom, I yanked the door open, the sounds behind me now unhinged, a symphony of chuckles and whispers transforming into blood-curdling screams. I darted out into the night, my heart pounding frantically against my ribcage, adrenaline surging as I stumbled across the empty parking lot. However, as I glanced back one last time, I saw them standing in the entrance of the mall, dozens of mannequins, no longer frozen, but now fully animated, mocking, laughing madly in the moonlight, their eyes aglow with a sinister gleam. Panic and dread fused into one as I sprinted to my car, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to escape. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys, heart racing, every nerve ending alert with primal fear. Just as I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door, I caught a glimpse of the back seats through the rearview mirror, and there, seated among my possessions, was one of them, a mannequin, grinning widely, dressed in the last outfit it had worn in the store. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at me with those soulless eyes. As that infernal laughter echoed in my ears, I revved the engine and sped away, vowing never to return. But deep down, I knew the laughter would always haunt me, a chilling reminder that the night the mannequins moved was just the beginning.
I remember the day I decided to create a YouTube channel. I was tired of feeling invisible, tired of the mundane routine that my life had become. I wanted an escape, a chance to voice my thoughts and creativity, to grab hold of my future. I poured my heart into my first video, a backstory about my struggles with anxiety and the isolation that came with it. With shaky hands, I hit upload and watched as the view count spun slowly upward. A few likes trickled in, and I felt a spark of hope ignite within me. But that spark was snuffed out only a few hours later. I had my first comment. I opened it, expecting encouragement or at least indifference, but instead, I was met with a barrage of insults, each one sharp like a dagger. "You have no personality," it read. "Just stop. You're a joke." I was paralyzed, my heart racing, my palms sweaty. It felt like I had handed my heart to a group of vultures, and they were feasting on it with reckless abandon. I stared at the screen, my face flushed with anger and shame. I was crushed. The thought of quitting gnawed at me, but then, like a flicker of a dying flame, a small voice inside me whispered to stay. So, I decided to fight back. I convinced myself that I wouldn't allow a stranger's words to dictate my path. The next day, I was back at it, filming again, this time focusing on the things I loved, gaming, art, and the little pleasures in life. The video was better than the last, filled with laughter and a sense of authenticity. I uploaded it and awaited the tide. Comments began pouring in, some were good, some were bad, and some were downright cruel. In the midst of this chaos, a name kept appearing in the comments, Fredius. At first, it just seemed like an anonymous troll, but each jibe was crafted with meticulous care, targeting my insecurities like a sniper. "Nice try, loser," he'd say. "Why are you even breathing?" I began to spiral, obsessively refreshing the comments sections and my notifications. I recognized his name like a dull toothache. I simply couldn't ignore it. Each jab dug deeper into my psyche, and paranoia settled in. Is this what I wanted? What if he was right? Maybe I would never be good enough. But I didn't want to give Friedius the satisfaction of ruining my passion. So I took an approach I hadn't considered before. I would confront him. I uploaded a video titled An Open Letter to My Critics, where I addressed my fears and frustrations directly to Friedius. I managed to create a heartfelt plea, exposing myself and my emotions. I shared how these comments made me feel, my struggles with anxiety, and how I let it get to me. I thought it would resonate with my audience, and I was right. The video gained traction, more likes and shares than I'd seen before. Initially, I felt the sweet taste of triumph, but then came the backlash. Friedius struck again. He replied with a video of his own, and I felt my heart drop. Watching that video was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you can't take a step back. He tore into me with a vitriol I wasn't prepared for. Look at this pathetic loser begging for sympathy, he said, with a smug grin plastered across his face. You think we care? And just like that, I was plunged back into despair. My thoughts spiraled, and it felt like I had stepped into a dark void. The comments, the likes, they all began to fade at rapid speed. I considered quitting again, just vanishing from the web forever. I spent days in bed, staring at a ceiling that felt like it was pressing down on me. It was like a black cloud was hovering over me, no sign of sun ever poking through. But just as I felt myself sinking deeper, something inside me began to stir again. A voice, strong this time, insisted that I confront my demons head-on. I decided to turn my pain into power. Instead of vanishing, I recorded my darkest moments, documenting my journey through depression and criticism, detailing how to face a nemesis like Friedius. What if I used my platform to channel all of that despair into something constructive? This would be my time to show not only him but everyone who felt like me that they weren't alone. I dug deep, and what came out was raw, honest, and liberating. I released the video titled Healing Through Hate. It was my realest work yet, unfiltered and genuine. It resonated with a wide audience. Hundreds began sharing their stories, and for the first time, I felt strong. A wave of support swept in, drowning out the echoes of Friedius. The likes surged, the comments filled with messages of gratitude and understanding. But Friedius wouldn't back down. He resurfaced, this time with a mocking smile and a challenge. You're getting sympathy, not strength. Come face me, he said in another video. This was my moment. I rallied my supporters, a community I didn't realize I had built. We fought back, not just against Friedius, but against the societal expectations that made us feel weak and vulnerable. I organized a live stream, planning to confront him publicly, to let everyone see that the words of one troll couldn't sever my voice. On the day of the stream, people flooded in. As the hour approached, my heart raced. I was terrified, but there was something powerful about knowing I wasn't facing this alone. The chat exploded with supportive messages, each one pushing me forward. And then, there he was, Friedius, mocking and arrogant, but alongside the collective will of my community, I was ready. In the heat of the moment, he couldn't deny the growth I had achieved, the strength I had gathered, and the laughter I now embraced. When it was over, I didn't emerge victorious just over Friedius, but I conquered my own personal demons, the ones that told me I would always be weak. The next few days were surreal. Friedius's words turned to whispers in my mind. I finally realized that it didn't matter what he thought, or if he believed in me, because I finally believed in myself. I started to push out consistent content, flourished in my creativity, and built a community that thrived on positivity and authentic connection. Each person who had once faced criticism and emerged on the other side became part of my journey. In a twisted way, Friedius had become my unintended catalyst for transformation. I learned that criticism doesn't define your worth, it's a stepping stone on the path to growth. So, to anyone out there facing the weight of the world's criticism, let me tell you, there's strength to be found in your vulnerability. Feed off the negativity, rise above it, and you might just find your community. I know I did. The time I took a risk and it paid off, a personal win. The time I took a risk and it paid off began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that lulls you into believing nothing extraordinary could ever happen. I was sitting in my cramped cubicle at the marketing firm where I'd worked for 3 monotonous years, staring at the flickering screen of my ancient computer. My boss had just handed me yet another assignment that felt like busy work rather than anything meaningful, and the weight of my stagnant life pressed heavily on my chest. That was when the email arrived, a single notification that broke through the haze of boredom. It was from a small, independent client I'd done some freelance work for in the past, a startup run by a couple of passionate yet chaotic entrepreneurs. They'd always appreciated my ideas, even the ones that were a bit unconventional, and the email was a proposal. They wanted to launch a bold, ambitious campaign and were offering me the chance to lead it. Not as a freelancer, but as their new creative director. My heart skipped a beat as I read the message. The salary was less than what I made at the firm, and there were no guarantees. The startup was still finding its footing, and joining them meant leaving behind the stability of my current job, lackluster as it was. But there was a catch. I had to decide by the end of the day. My immediate reaction was to say no. It was too risky. I had bills to pay, responsibilities to manage. I couldn't just throw caution to the wind for some unproven opportunity. But as I sat there, staring at the email, something deep inside me rebelled against the idea of playing it safe yet again. I thought about all the late nights spent dreaming about doing something that mattered, something that felt alive. I thought about the little notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer, filled with ideas and sketches for campaigns that would never see the light of day at my current job. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder, what if? The rest of the day passed in a blur of indecision. I drafted and deleted my resignation letter more times than I could count. I called my best friend, who encouraged me to go for it, saying I'd regret it forever if I didn't. I called my parents, who were less enthusiastic, reminding me of the importance of security and long-term planning. By the time the clock struck 5, I still hadn't made up my mind. My hands were shaking as I finally typed out a response to the startup's email, accepting their offer. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then walked into my boss's office and handed in my resignation. His reaction was predictably condescending, a mix of surprise and thinly veiled disdain. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, clearly doubting my judgment. But for the first time in my life, I felt certain. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Joining the startup was like stepping into an entirely different world. The office was small and chaotic, the team was a mix of quirky personalities, and every day felt like a battle to keep the ship afloat. But it was exhilarating. I was given the freedom to experiment, to try ideas that would have been laughed out of the room at my old job. I poured my heart and soul into the campaign, working late into the night, fueled by adrenaline and the thrill of doing something that mattered. There were moments of doubt, of course. Times when the pressure felt unbearable, when I wondered if I'd made a huge mistake. The startup's limited budget meant we had to get creative, finding ways to make an impact without the resources of bigger companies. But every setback only fueled my determination. I was finally doing work that challenged me, that made me feel alive. The campaign launched 6 months later, and the response was beyond anything we could have imagined. It went viral almost overnight, capturing the attention of major media outlets and skyrocketing the startup's visibility. Our social media accounts exploded with engagement, sales surged, and suddenly, we were no longer just another struggling startup, we were a contender. I remember sitting in the tiny office with the rest of the team, watching the numbers climb higher and higher on the screen, and feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time, I understood what it meant to take a risk and see it pay off. That campaign became a turning point not just for the startup, but for me personally. It proved to me that I was capable of more than I'd ever given myself credit for, that I could take a leap of faith and land on my feet. The experience taught me the value of trusting my instincts, of embracing uncertainty, and of pursuing the things that truly set my soul on fire. Looking back now, I can see how pivotal that decision was. It wasn't just about leaving one job for another, it was about choosing to believe in myself, to take control of my own destiny instead of settling for a life of mediocrity. That one email, that one moment of courage, changed everything. And while the journey wasn't easy, I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.